Hi, I'm Baldur Brönnimann, and this is the Conducting Coaching Podcast, where we talk about conducting from the inside. Hello everybody. Today we'll talk about something that often comes up when we talk about preparation. The question, if it's okay to use recordings when preparing your scores. In earlier times, this would be a total non-issue because there were no recordings, or then later on, there was just lots of repertoire that wasn't recorded yet, or recordings were not so easy to come by. But nowadays, recordings are just a fact. They're everywhere and they're really accessible. Learning a score from a recording was, for a long time, looked down upon. Even in the 1990s, when I studied, a conductor was fundamentally supposed to learn a score at the piano. It was part of a conductor's trade to be able to transpose voices, play different parts, play a score fundamentally at a keyboard instrument. I still remember all these exercises we had to do, playing Bach chorales in all these exotic keys in order to learn transpositions and putting different voices together, playing small excerpts from scores and then putting all the rest in, etc., just to try and give you some structure to be able to compress scores into something you can play on a keyboard. But does that mean that it's really bad or really unprofessional to use a recording to learn a score? Let's have a look at this. The big criticism of learning scores from recordings was always that a recording is not really what is written in the score, it's an interpretation. So what you do is you don't look at the facts, at something that the composer wrote, but you learn a piece from how somebody reads this information. So fundamentally you create a second-hand interpretation, an interpretation that is based on another interpretation. There's so many recordings around nowadays that recordings nearly become works in themselves. I sometimes read reviews where people compare my concerts to some recordings, and in the discussion between conducting students, sometimes one looks at classic recordings, Giulini does this in 2 and Toscanini does this in 1 and in this tempo and so on. That, the recordings in itself or the interpretations become nearly more important than the work itself. An interesting book in that regard is The Complete Conductor by Gunther Schuller, which is fundamentally just a discussion of different recordings and how they deviate from each other and how they deviate, in his view, from the scores. But whoever made recordings knows that they're so open to so many things. The acoustic of a whole, the way an orchestra plays, the time you have to record something, so many aspects that have nothing to do with a conscious decision, but is just circumstantial. But then as nobody looks at the scores, these recordings, they become facts. They become the piece. Everybody assumes that certain things go in a certain way because they heard it that way on some recording. I remember a conversation I had with the late composer Harry Birtwistle. There was one section in his piece Tragoedia that he said was always played much too slow because Boulez recorded it so slow. But he said, why did I put a metronome marking there? That's what I really want. Now you have to give me a minute here to talk about a wider issue. The wider issue of facts and interpretation. Because it's the 20th of January 2025 and Donald Trump and his friends are taking over at the White House. We are again going into the territory of alternative facts. Meaning just making things up. Inventing numbers, distorting statistics, believing the earth is flat. This is a worldwide phenomenon, and what really happens is that it matters much more what sounds more convincing, and if my interpretation sounds more convincing than the facts, then that's what it becomes. It becomes an alternative fact. But music is not simply a social network. We have facts, we have scores, we have things that composers write down in order to get as close as possible to their musical information. So these are the sources we have to go back to. If we don't go back to the score, we just listen to interpretations. We listen to what other people thought about the piece. Or maybe even they were thinking about other interpretations before them. And what happens is that in this process, the facts or the score becomes more and more irrelevant. And what we do in this whole process is something like community checking the facts. So just exchanging opinions and not really looking what is there. So what happens next then is that some recordings or some interpretations become more relevant than others because they're made by famous orchestras or famous conductors, by big recording houses and so on. And they sort of seem to be more convincing than others. So in the general conscience, they become the pieces. So needless to say, but I think as conductors, we need a deeper, a more informed, and also a more professional look at the pieces we're conducting. But then again, as we prepare a piece at the piano, there are lots of limitations. First of all, it's a piano. You can never really simulate an orchestra. There is some benefit in having to imagine every instrument, but still a piano fundamentally is a percussion instrument. And to make that transition to the real sound of a score in reality, in the acoustic and with the instruments and so on, is very difficult. It's just a very one-dimensional view of a score. Also, if you're not a pianist, you will spend a long time on your piano technique just simply trying to play everything that you're reading. And there's certain things you just can't play. You can't play real orchestral intonation, for example. And as more you go into the 20th century, 21st century, there are more and more elements of a score that you just simply can't reproduce on a piano. Because first of all, it's not conceived on a piano, but then we're talking microtonal things, we're talking percussive elements. I remember when I did Le Grand Macabre by Ligeti, which is, a piece, an opera that's from the 80s. Even there were so many things that one just couldn't do on a piano. You had to sing it, you had to tap it, whatever, but it just didn't lend itself to be played on a piano. The good thing about learning a score at the piano is the reading aspect, because you really have to look at absolutely everything. Plus, you have to imagine much harder, because there's no recording that gives you something to aim for. You have to create all these sounds within yourselves. You have to read what is on the page and try to create an orchestral sound in your imagination. Now, in conductors or conducting students who are very accomplished pianists, I think this reading effect sometimes is a little bit diminished in a sense that people can sort of skim over a score and still give a very decent impression of what this could sound like, but they don't have this extra step to take to really work hard to imagine something deeply and exactly. And this deep imagination is what you need to get a score into your mind and into your body. So what I'm saying here is that being able to play a score at the piano is not enough. You have to go one step beyond. So what shall we really use to learn a score? Recordings, piano, something else? I think all these techniques have a place in learning a score. You just have to decide exactly when and where. I think listening to a recording has its place at the very beginning of a learning process, because it gives you a bit of a head start. It makes certain things a bit faster at the very beginning, but there are two conditions. First of all, you just have to do it very sparingly and at the beginning, and second, you have always to go back at the score and look what is actually written there. And at some stage, you have to start practicing without listening to recordings anymore. Because that's when you start reading things for yourselves. And you put the sounds of what you heard in the recording through the physical reading and understanding process. You compare it with the score and you start making up your own opinion of what you really see in that score. That's when your inner perception starts to change. And when you're in that score studying process, when you go deeper into looking what the composer actually wrote, that's when a piano sometimes is useful, because it can just point you to certain things. It can help you sustain a bit better your inner imagination. Just give you a bit of a help to get closer to what you're actually reading. But nothing, no recording and no session at the piano can substitute your time with a score and the imagining that goes with this. The reading, sitting there, looking at the score and imagining the sounds and getting them bit by bit into your system. This is something you have to do alone with your score. As I say, you can use recordings at the beginning, but just so much that they don't become the score for you, that the memory of what you listened to was not so strong that you can't get it out of your mind anymore, because you will have to put it through the filter of your reading. And then again, once you know a piece, then you can listen to other recordings to compare other interpretations, but you have to make sure that yours is firm inside yourselves first. I personally think that the best way of learning a score is being able to reproduce it as much as possible by yourselves. And don't mean with the help of anything really. Just singing, tapping, imagining sounds, whistling, whatever, but just doing things by yourselves and trying to recreate the score with your own body. That sometimes even means conducting, shaping sounds, just helping your imagination. And this is something that you can't do either with a recording or with a piano. You just have to do it with a score alone. I think it's a very beautiful stage when you're just able to walk across a park and imagining a piece from beginning to the end, imagining how it's written and imagining the sounds and so on. That's when you can start really making this your own and creating your personal interpretation. When I already know a piece, or I'm in the middle of some rehearsals and so on, I sometimes sit down at the piano and just play a few passages or check something out and so on, because I think it's maybe not quite clear in my mind, and then the piano can help a little bit. But both recordings and pianos, they can help. You just have to know exactly when and where to use them. Reading and preparing scores is a thing that we all do. So as always, I'm looking forward to your reactions. Send me an email, write on Instagram, write on Spotify. I'll try to answer as much as I can. So have a great time, and I'll catch up with you next week here on the Conducting Coaching Podcast. Thanks for listening. To send us your comments or suggestions, please write us a message on Instagram. And don't forget to subscribe to our newsletter to stay up to date with all the conducting coaching news and events.